Hi, I'm Amy Cardoso, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Museum of Fine Arts Houston and speak with curator Bradley Brooks about the exhibition Texas Clay, 19th Century Pottery from the Bayou Bend Collection. Now for Art This Week. Bradley, thanks so much for joining us today to have a discussion about the collection that we're going to look at. I thought we'd start with a couple of general questions just to give our listeners, our viewers, an idea of the context of how this came to be. So first, thinking about Bayou Bend Collection, how did they come to, or how did you come to have such a large collection of pottery?
Ima Hogg was the woman who built Bayou Bend and who started the collection of American furniture and decorative arts there beginning in the 1920s. And she had established, beginning in the 1960s, a space within Bayou Bend where she wanted to highlight Texas material. And at first, that was a lot of material related to the Mexican-American War, prints, figured flasks, things like that. But she was interested in furniture made in Texas, and she supported scholarship on furniture made in Texas and then began to collect it. And the first piece of Texas-made pottery entered the collection after Miss Hogg passed in the early 1980s. It's this jar by Nash that's behind us over here, this beautiful red jar.
And maybe you could tell us how this collection ended up being shown today here in Houston and the importance of it, because obviously for listeners who may have done some research but others may not have, a number of these pots were made by enslaved African Americans, and honoring and recognizing those men, those slaves at the time. I mean, that's quite an important venture.
Oh yes, absolutely. I think, one can look at this collection of pottery and see in it many points of resonance with the history of Texas. The people who came to Texas and made pottery echo larger patterns of immigration, people who came to Texas from places in the lower South. Texas was essentially a growing western outpost of this southern plantation culture, and so the people who were early settlers here, many of them were coming from Alabama and Georgia and the Carolinas. And so we have works here in this pottery collection made by people who came through those areas, moved their potteries further west. There were some who came with enslaved potters who then worked for them here, and some who established potteries here in Texas, some with enslaved people working as potters. It's not the majority of the pottery in the exhibition, but it's a segment of the pottery, and of course then it reflects that aspect of the history of early Texas.
And the wonderful catalogue that comes with it really discusses that part as well of the history of these pots, even if it's maybe not the predominant number in the collection. Maybe we could talk about how pottery kind of arrived in Texas, so to speak, as far as, I mean, obviously you can go back to, much further back than the 1800s, but as far as this group of people kind of coming in from other parts of the United States, moving down into Texas, were they attracted by the land, the clay, or was it the idea of just moving further west onto the frontier?
Well, the big attraction for many people in early Texas was land. There's vast amounts of land, and it was available at very inexpensive rates, and that's the way the impresarios like Stephen F. Austin were trying to present it. They wanted the land to be inexpensive. Even in contrast to other areas in the United States, land in Texas was yet cheaper. So there was a strong attraction. And at the time, Texas was being settled, beginning in the 1820s and 30s and 40s by these impresarios. People coming to Texas would need the basics to support their families, their foodways and so forth. And stoneware pottery was a very important part of that because it was crucial for food storage and preservation years and years before any kind of artificial refrigeration, and certainly not even refrigeration by ice at that time. So much more traditional kinds of food preservation were necessary: drying, salting, preserving in lard or sugar, and all those things could be accomplished with stoneware vessels. So this was a basic commodity that people required for life in early Texas.
And before we talk about the glazes and the process, because there's a couple of different glazes that the catalogue mentions, including the alkaline glaze and the salt glaze.
Yes.
I thought maybe we could talk about the clays themselves and what was different about Texas clay and what that produced. I mean, I know there was more iron in some of the clay, if I'm right.
The clays are very variable. There's a map on the wall here in the exhibition that shows some of the major clay deposits that were used in Texas, and many of these stretched much farther east too. So these same clay deposits had outcroppings in different places in different states. And so I am not by any means an expert in ceramic chemistry, but it would have required certain qualities and consistencies in clay to be able to create stoneware from it. But as I said, a lot of these potteries were very basic and didn't have tremendously developed technology to process raw materials or to grind the materials that would then become glazes. So you see, I think, in a lot of this pottery, a variability in some of those areas that you might not see in some pottery made in other areas where the potteries were perhaps longer established or more mechanized, you might say, maybe not the best word, but geared to much larger production. So there's more variability, I think, in these materials, and you see that in many different areas, in their form and profile, in their glazes, in their colors, and also in the sort of accidental aspects of things that would come from changes in temperature, or things that are difficult to control under those conditions.
Yes, I know there's one pot in the catalogue that has these blue marks, and in a way they look fairly random, arbitrary, but at the same time they have this beautiful abstract feel about them, and that was an accident from something falling from the kiln ceiling onto, I don't know if it was a salt,
yes,
something falling on, and it created this blue on a white background.
Yes, it's a pot behind us, and if I recall, it was using salt to glaze the pots created deposits on the ceiling on the roof of the kiln. And so when the kiln reheated, some of these glaze deposits melted from the ceiling and dripped down into the pots below. I think sometimes it's fancifully called kiln kisses or something like that. But that's the sort of thing that you see where the kiln was being used for different kinds of glazes at different times. And so, it's again that variability that you wouldn't see perhaps in a pottery that's geared to much larger volume.
And can you tell me about the glazing process? What is the process of how the glaze is? What do you need to make a glaze, and what is alkaline glaze and salt glaze?
Well, there's many different ways to glaze, but one of the things that's prevalent in Texas pottery is, as you mentioned, alkaline or ash glazed ware. And this was something that relates strongly to the origin of many of these potters in the Carolinas, particularly in the Edgefield district of South Carolina, where they used wood ash as the flux to make the other elements of the glaze melt. So you've got aspects like ground glass perhaps, or other mineral elements, and you need something to help lower the melting point of that in the kiln.
So an impurity.
So a flux. And in this case, it was the wood ash had components in it that acted as a flux to allow these other things to melt and create the glaze. So when you look around this exhibit, the things that have the most strikingly mottled colors are absolutely these alkaline glazed wares. And this is important because it was a way to create a glaze with almost no bought materials. So for some of these early potters, salt in large quantities to use for glazing would have been an expense that they weren't able to bear or didn't want to get, or would be difficult to get consistently. Pottery can be glazed by throwing salt into the kiln after it's reached a high temperature, and at that high temperature the chlorine vaporizes and the sodium creates a glassy surface on the pots, and that's the things that are the most uniformly gray in character, you might say. And much of the pottery in the northeastern potteries and the midwestern potteries were salt glazed. It's predominantly a Germanic tradition that was used widely, but not in the traditions that grew out of the Edgefield districts in South Carolina and then throughout the South and into Texas. That tended to carry along this ash glazed or alkaline glazing technique that was a lot more adaptable to local conditions.
The scale of the pots vary hugely, and then you have a few different colours, but they're all within a kind of a muted spectrum. There's no huge, brash, bright colours. Was that an aesthetic choice, or was that the elements that they had on hand wouldn't allow for something like a bright magenta or a bright yellow?
Well, we're into a bit of speculation here, because these were absolutely first and foremost utilitarian wares, and they were being manufactured out of the materials that were at hand. Having said that, it's hard to look at some of these pots, seeing the care that was given to their form and so forth, and to think that the coloration and the texture of the glaze received no consideration on the part of the potter, because some of them are very beautiful and have a character all their own. But I don't think that the potters were making their predominant choices based on new color ranges the way potteries might do today.
Right, the aesthetics weren't so much as important as the function.
Well, they were.
I mean, they come together.
They were working in a much more limited range. Mm-hmm. You know, and so you get this wonderful range of earth tones in this Texas ware that has been glazed with the alkaline process, as opposed to the salt glazing process, and particularly as it appears in potteries in Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, where the things are almost uniformly gray. And I mean, functionally they're wonderful because they're very uniformly glazed and so forth, but they lack the range of tonalities and so forth that you see in this ash glazed ware or alkaline glazed ware.
And can we talk now about how African American slaves were brought into the pottery industry?
It's a question that I think we wish we knew a lot more about. And of all the potteries where that was the case, the H. Wilson Pottery Company mm-hmm.
Is the one about which we know the most. And even there, I don't think it's clear exactly how and where the potters, the enslaved potters, were taught. Whether they were taught by others before they came to Texas, or whether they were taught here, or it was some combination of those things. I think it's safe to say that, we know that enslaved people were often taught in trades and crafts because they were first and foremost, horribly to say so, but they were property, and they were more valuable if they had more skill.
Right.
And so a person who could throw pots was more valuable than someone who could only labor in the field. So someone who had enslaved labor that was more, had more skills, had more valuable property. Mm-hmm. But it's just, there aren't enough examples about which we have extensive information that we can generalize about that, except to say, I think that it was a more valuable laborer who had specific skills, whether that was carpentry or blacksmithing or pottery or tanning or any of those other things that were necessary to support the sorts of life and work that were taking place throughout the 19th century South.
Right, and I believe they think that Wilson had created a system where if you weren't in the field all the time, you would be then making pots part of the time if you were a man. But I noticed that there's no discussion of women making pots. Was that something that was considered a masculine trade? Or was there a reason why women were women in the kitchen, therefore there was no time for them to make pots? Or?
Well, there are some potteries in early Texas where we know there was involvement with women. We don't always know, again, as much about that as we'd like to, or the extent of their involvement, but we know there was some involvement. Remember, too, that most craftspeople at the time were men, and that this craft was carried on mostly by family tradition and learning within the family. But it was also extremely arduous work. It was very much lifting, very heavy work. When you look at some of these pots with capacities of 5 or 6 or 8 gallons, you're imagining, reaching down into this pot and lifting heavy amounts of clay forming it into shape, and that's just the final work. That has nothing to do with excavating the clay and processing the clay and working it into balls and so forth. This is very, very heavy labor.
So they would do all of this. They're not just in, today's day you buy a lump of clay and they're actually digging it out of the ground and doing the full kind of gamut.
They've got to dig the clay, they've got to process the clay, they've got to shape the clay, fire the clay, glaze the clay. This is all done in these very small scale potteries. So it's very heavy work, and I think that's why predominantly it was carried out by men.
And so, through your description, you're suggesting the conditions a little. I'm wondering where they're actually making the pots. Are they making them in a kind of a reserved space purely for pottery, or was it part of where they were living?
I think because of the materials needed to be used and the tools required, that there was probably, you would have to likely see specialized buildings in a lot of these cases, because you've got, as I say, clay to process, clay to keep dry, or clay that you need to keep wet, and so forth. So you would have to have places where you could process your material, form the pots, set them out to become leather hard, to get them to the state where they need to go into the kiln. So you need to create space to do this. But this is probably going to be on a farmstead where there are a variety of buildings in close proximity, dwellings, barns, structures to keep animals. And if you are working some kind of a craft like this, structures to support and protect your materials and tools for things like pottery making.
Right, so a relatively controlled environment for that time.
I think you would wish to do that to the greatest extent possible.
Great.
And certainly the later potteries, of which we have photographs, show buildings with those kinds of structures like that.
And the catalogue for the exhibition discusses a lot of the pre-Civil War circumstances, but it also does allude to those times after, and with emancipation of African Americans, they now had a trade that they then often took on or could take elsewhere. And Wilson's slaves, some of his slaves, and correct me if I'm wrong, some of his slaves stayed and worked with him because it was a better trade than what else might be available to them. But there were 5 Wilson slaves that created their own space.
The pottery that John Wilson had established, he sold his last bit of ownership interest in it in the years after the Civil War, in about 1869. And after that time, a group of his enslaved laborers established H. Wilson and Company as a pottery, and that was one of the first African-American owned businesses in Texas. And there were few options for agricultural laborers at the time. So someone who had recently experienced emancipation probably had very few options, one of which was sharecropping, or to continue to live a lifestyle very similar to that would have existed under slavery, with only minimal differences probably. Or if someone had a trade, they had the opportunity perhaps to establish themselves in business, which is what was the case with the H. Wilson pottery.
And they actually created a distinguished difference between the previous pottery made under the master Wilson. I believe that the handles were different and the interior slip was different, and they also had a stamp.
Mm-hmm. Those were differences, not dramatic differences, but notable differences. And it may be that they were stamping their wares for a number of reasons. It could be that they were very proud of their accomplishments. It could be that they were in an environment where there was growing competition, and that it was more important to distinguish their work if it was quality and someone said, I want another one of those after they broke the butter churn. That was H. Wilson, we'll go get another one, or we need 10 more jars. We'll get these Wilson jars that served us so well. It's a broader dynamic that later pots tend to be more often marked by maker's name than earlier ones, and so there could be a number of reasons that contribute to that.
So possibly quite business savvy.
It could be largely an economic reason.
So at your leisure, I thought it would be great for us to discuss this piece because it's so strikingly different from the other pots that we see and pitchers and jars in this show. So if maybe you could tell us why it's so different.
Of course. The pot here, the so-called temperance jug, is quite a recent addition to Bayou Bend's pottery collection.
wonderfully different from the other things in the room because, as we talked about, the pottery in this tradition is utilitarian, period, with almost no exceptions. And this is a great exception. This man, John L. Stone, we believe learned his pottery trade in Anna, Illinois, under the direction of some men named Kirkpatrick, who had established a pottery there and were well known for making these pots covered with snakes. And many of them had messages about temperance written on them. And of course, the 19th century was leading up to the temperance that eventually gave us prohibition. And so the question is, how do you reconcile this seeming temperance message? You know, there's the person sunk into the bottle covered with snakes. You know, he's clearly a drunkard. Well, people who made pottery supplied distilleries. You know, distilleries and liquor manufacturers were one of the great clients for pottery manufacturers. So it makes sense that pottery manufacturers wouldn't have wanted to do anything to be off-putting to their major clients. So it's speculated among scholars that this is more a tongue-in-cheek kind of thing and not necessarily, you know, a moralistic statement about the temperance movement. The ones made in Texas are far rarer even than the ones made in Illinois. There are only a few of these known, but you can see if you do them in comparison to the ones made in Illinois that there are many similarities, including the figure emerging from the pot and sort of bedeviled by snakes and other creepy crawly things. If you look, you can see spiders and lizards, and there was probably some other critters that have since broken off the pot. But it's an extravagantly sculptural and different object from the other ones in the exhibition. So it's here, it's sort of the exception that proves the rule, that, you know, we're in a utilitarian tradition and here's an object that was clearly made for other purposes. It kind of makes us question exactly what the message is that it's sending, but it's in that same tradition, stoneware, salt glazed, with a little bit of the blue cobalt decoration that many people associate with stoneware pottery.
So we've talked at various times about the functional value of these pots, and also, as you said, the utilitarian reasoning behind it. So this might be a good piece to look at as far as what it was used for and why it was made as it is.
Of course. We talked about the need for food preservation, food storage. Also, sort of food processes are also part of this. And what we see here is a butter churn made by a man called John Leopard, who has other examples in the show, and you can see by this and others that he thought, I think, very carefully about the profiles of his wares and making them attractive as well as utilitarian. But again, this is at a time and place where people are making their own butter. They're not buying it from elsewhere. And so, you know, you had to be able to gather the milk, separate the cream from the milk, which usually involved milk pans. In other words, vessels to allow the cream to separate from the milk. The cream would then be poured off, and at the right time, it could be put into a butter churn and processed. So it's a process of using the dasher in the churn and moving it up and down through the cream, and this will eventually make the fat particles coagulate one to another. So they say the butter comes together, or they would, you know, say, wait till the butter comes as you're working the dasher. So in a vessel like this, you're making your own butter, you know, at home, so to speak. So it would have been necessary to have one of these basic foodstuffs. If you don't make it, you don't have it.
Right. And the shape, the fact that it's larger at the top than at the bottom, is there a reasoning for that as far as the process, or that's an aesthetic?
I will guess that it's more an individual variation than it has to do with the actual form. I was wondering about that, and if that had to do with trying to make the fat concentrate in one area of the churn, but there are others that are more nearly completely cylindrical. So I'm guessing that the actual shape didn't really advance or impede the process tremendously. But when you look at the profile of these churns and other things by Leopard, you can see that, you know, he has the shoulders of the vessel done in such a way that the handles are protected, so that if they're clustered together, the handles are less likely to break and so forth. So the configuration, I think, is thoughtfully done, and it might have had something to do with, you know, keeping protecting the jar from damage as much as maybe trying to advance the process of butter making. I've
Right.
never made my own butter, so I'm just speculating.
Yeah, nor have I. I'm thinking also, I guess every potter will have their own opinion and perspective on what, you know, is a better form maybe for making something, or the engineering behind it. So I guess depending on who the person is, they'll come up with their own
Or he was taught.
manifesto.
Yeah,
or he was
taught a specific form, you know, in the community or the tradition in which he grew up. So you'd have some with rounded shoulders and perhaps some with straight and other variations.
We want to thank Bradley for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to mfah.org. That's it for us this week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your